Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining us at the MarketSite studio, we have Tony Seo, Head of Regulatory Strategy and Innovation for Anti-Financial Crime at Nasdaq, to discuss Nasdaq's recent surveillance conference held in Tokyo, Japan. It is great to see you as always, Tony. Welcome back to Trade Talks.
Hi, thanks, Jill.
And this month's regulatory roundup, you share some of the key insights from Nasdaq's recent surveillance conference held in Tokyo. Can you tell us a little bit more about the conference? Who attended? What was covered?
Yeah, so we did the conference. We used to do it every year, and we stopped during the pandemic. So this is the first in-person one, so it was actually quite exciting. So I saw a lot of people that I hadn't seen for kind of quite a few years. So we get surveillance leaders from around the world to really kind of just focus and talk about kind of what's happening, right, and how do we improve market integrity. So this year we had 122 attendees from 48 different companies from 25 different countries. So it was fantastic. So we talked mostly focusing on regulatory priorities as well as technology. That tends to be the focus. But I think that the real kind of draw card is always the case studies. So we had a lot of really interesting case studies this time. So we had actually the FBI come and they talked through a case study about the Martin Shkreli case, which was really interesting. We had kind of SGX and kind of CMA talk about 2 AI initiatives, which is kind of quite interesting as well. And then we also had kind of very hyper-focused case studies where we went through cross-market manipulation, marking the close, and kind of like new forms of price manipulation.
Curious to hear about your fireside chat with Commissioner Carolyn Pham of the US CFTC. What did Commissioner Pham have to say?
Oh, that was a very exciting one. So Commissioner Pham had just recently announced her US pilot program for digital assets. Right, so that was kind of actually quite fascinating to hear her kind of talk around kind of like the reasons around that pilot program, right, and kind of what the hope for a goal out of that program. I think it's kind of really kind of fantastic, very kind of proactive in terms of the efforts to try and kind of bring the industry together to discuss how can we kind of together with the regulators and industry work together to drive digital assets forward. Right, particularly kind of as we've seen kind of the regulators become more kind of enforcement aggressive lately, right? And kind of one of the interesting ones being the enforcements against kind of 3 DeFi firms that happened kind of a few weeks back, right? It kind of shows how the CFTC is kind of being more active and kind of like this kind of very kind of like new space around DeFi and kind of putting their kind of view in terms of kind of how DeFi should be regulated potentially and kind of partly how DeFi potentially could be regulated, kind of whether the technology aspect, irrespective of itself, but if the products and behavior kind of fit within kind of existing traditional asset standards, right, then a lot of the existing regulations do apply, right? So that was quite interesting. And then also ESG has always been a hot topic in the past few days, and it was that week as well. And Commissioner Pham talked about the kind of recent kind of formation of the Environmental Fraud Task Force, right? And kind of the reasons and the kind of hopes for kind of approach of that task force from the CFTC.
Surveillance in a New World was another interesting session that you had moderated. What was covered in that session and what did you think were some of the important takeaways?
So surveillance in the New World is really talking about how kind of surveillance has changed over the past few years. I think one of the biggest changes has been the real kind of the growth in retail activity that we've seen. And that growth in retail activity has kind of had this knock-on effect in terms of kind of how people trade, how they interact with the markets, how they learn about investments. So one of the big hot topics was social media. Mm-hmm. Right, so we're talking a lot about social media. And kind of one of the panelists kind of very interestingly was saying how a lot of activity had recently been moving off platforms like X or Twitter or Reddit and onto things like Discord and TikTok, right? And it's kind of showing how kind of even this kind of new area, it's also evolving quite quickly. And then as these kind of like social media activity moves to these kind of new types of platforms, then you get new challenges with kind of how do you interact, monitor, or kind of survey kind of voice and video, right? And it kind of brings kind of new technical and practical challenges to the whole space as well. So we talked about it quite a bit. We also talked about meme stocks. We actually had kind of quite a few people who had been there on the front line during the kind of meme stock craze of 21. And there was a kind of real kind of question of like, are we going to see kind of this type of activity happen kind of again, kind of in that same style? And also, I mean, it was kind of very US centric, right? And there was a big question of kind of, are we going to see that activity kind of elsewhere around the world?
Yeah, and that's really what the challenge is. The technology and investor behavior is evolving so much more quicker than the regulators can actually get a framework around. So I want to talk about that for a minute. You moderated a panel discussion on regulatory priorities with some global regulators. What can you share about their views?
It was quite interesting. So AI has been quite a hot topic amongst regulators this year, right, where a lot of regulators are kind of looking at AI, kind of how they may impact financial markets. A hot debate that we had during the panel was around ethical AI, right? And really the question was kind of like, what does ethical AI constitute from a financial markets technology perspective? And there was a open question in terms of how involved should regulators even be around the ethical AI and the technology aspects of how people are using AI from that perspective, right? One of the kind of discussion points was that if the regulators aren't doing it, then kind of who else is going to take that kind of mantle of kind of drive ethical AI usage, right? Especially as we're seeing the technology kind of grow so significantly. One of the other kind of areas, and as I mentioned, kind of technology was, and emerging technologies was a kind of huge aspect, was talking about high frequency trading. That was actually quite an interesting topic for the regulators. Japan has seen a kind of very large increase in HFT activity over the past few years. So at the moment, I think it's about 60% of activity on the marketplace, right? Which is kind of significant growth from previous years. So they had actually just finished a study on HFT activity in Japan, right? And the SEC in Japan is reviewing how they're going to regulate HFT activity in Japan. And it was quite interesting in the group because we had regulators from the US, from the EU, and it was interesting that they were able to share their experience with kind of monitoring those programs in the US and EU.
Yeah, well, of course, I mean, we have a lot of experience with HFT in the US. So when you look ahead to October, which of course is Cybersecurity Awareness Month as well, any thoughts on what you think you'll see from regulators and the industry?
Well, I think the topic of ESG, kind of we saw the recent kind of announcement from the SEC, right, is going to be quite significant, right? The SEC announcement has actually been one of multiple kind of ESG reporting and such related announcements from regulators globally, right? So this has been a focus area for regulators for 2023, right? So I expect to see kind of more activity kind of in that space kind of going into next month.
All right, Tony, appreciate the insight as always. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. And thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.